Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to my home. My name is Dwight, and this is week 2 of our series on the book of Revelation at Long Creek Baptist Church. I'm so glad you could join me. Now, if you haven't taken the time to watch week 1, which kind of lays out the rules of the road for this series, I encourage you to pause and watch that message first. Most of the messages, all of the messages in this series actually, are going to build on one another. Many of the sermons that we preach can kind of serve standalone, but this series, because of the nature of the book of Revelation, it would be very, very helpful for you to both watch the previous messages and to read the assigned chapters of the book. So the assignment for this message was Revelation chapters 1 through 3. So if you haven't watched the previous message, or if you haven't read the text, I'd encourage you to pause right now and do so. If you have done previously the assignment, so to speak, or the homework, I want to jump in to some of the understanding of what we should expect from Revelation chapters 1 through 3. You know, every year when we're able, Crystal and I have an open house at our home around Christmas time. And one of the activities that we tend to do is we play Jenga. If you are unfamiliar with Jenga, is a series of blocks that stack on one another, and the assignment is to pull out a block from this tower of blocks and not have the tower fall over. It's kind of a social experiment, and it's a good time as well. The social experiment for me is watching the different styles, the different approaches to even a very simplistic game like Jenga. Some who have no interest in being watched and no interest in even playing the game actually rush in and grab a block and hope for the best. They'd rather the whole tower fall down than have to pull another block while everybody's eyes are on them. Others are strategizing. While everyone else is pulling their block out, they're watching, they're plotting, they're planning. Maybe they're even playing psychological games with those who are going ahead of them. There's all kinds of ways that people approach the game of Jenga, and likewise there's all kinds of ways that people can approach reading Scripture. We identified last week that there are numerous genres of Scripture, different styles of writing. The Bible is a collection of collections, and as we read Revelation, I think it's important, especially in these introductory chapters, to read the text as it was intended to be read. I don't know about you, but when I read Revelation chapters 1 through 3, I read from my own perspective. As I read the letters to the churches, for example, I tried to pick out, what's the message for me? What's the message for me? What's the message for me? Where's my church like that church? And what's Jesus saying to my church through that church? And that's not a bad intent whatsoever. It's just we sometimes miss the context of what it must have felt like for the original readers to read these letters. Likewise, we can sometimes miss the beauty of the context of what John the Revelator must have felt like as he was on the Lord's day in a cave and received a vision of Jesus Christ the King. So if there was a message title this morning for this sermon, it would be Christ the King and Christ the Communicator. Christ the King and Christ the Communicator. If you remember in Revelation chapter 1, beginning to read, I don't even have my glasses with me, we remember the message and the image that John the Revelator had of Jesus. We remember what the different frameworks were that he picked out of Jesus, what his hair was like, the sword coming out of his mouth, all of the imagery, the gold belt tied around his waist. And one in particular was very, very striking. At the end of Revelation chapter 1, we read that Jesus, and he identified himself as Christ, who had been dead and is now risen and alive forevermore. He held in his right hand 7 stars. And there were 7 lampstands. Jesus identifies the lampstands as these 7 churches to whom the letters are to go out to and to whom he has a message for. But there's also the 7 stars. This is point number 1. Jesus is Christ the King. What do the 7 stars mean? Well, obviously, in the book of Revelation chapter 1, Jesus seems to make it very clear what the 7 stars mean. They are the elders or the angels that represent the 7 churches. But there's far more to this than just imagery representing 7 elders or 7 angels that therefore represent the 7 churches. You see, in the original context, the church had been now growing for about 50 years. Jesus had died about 50 years prior, and for much of that time, the church had had a pretty good go of it. Evangelism had been taking place. There had been reasonably little persecution until Nero. And Nero blamed, as you might remember, the Christians for a massive fire that happened in Rome. After Nero and the persecution of Nero, it didn't get much better. There was another Caesar named Domitian, and he likewise persecuted the Christians. Now, it was an odd thing to persecute the Christians because typically Romans, whenever they conquered a nation or a people or a tribe, would assimilate their religious structure. They'd assimilate their God into the overall system. So all gods were equal. No matter what God you worshipped, it was okay. You were all going to the same place anyway. Might that sound familiar, I wonder? And yet, under Nero and then under Domitian, the message of the cross, the message of Jesus, who says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That was received with less and less patience. And so more and more persecution began to occur. Now, the church didn't stop growing. New people kept coming to find Christ, and the church continued to grow even though there was suffering. But remember, there had been 50 years since Jesus had died and ascended to heaven. The fatigue must have been starting to set in. And now all of a sudden we have these letters that John has said have come from Jesus Christ himself. Now these letters are challenging. There's some parts of these churches that were not going well. There were behaviors that were not in line with what the Apostle Paul would write or what Jesus would even teach. And so there was some criticism that was involved there. And yet, if you were a member of one of those early churches, and you had not had a word of encouragement or a word of communication from Jesus the Christ for 50 years, how would you have responded? I think to hear that there was an image and there was a revelation that had credibility and authority, I would be thrilled to receive a word from Christ the King. Now, I mentioned Domitian, and he had an infant son who died. And one of the ways that they celebrated that infant son was they made him a god. They deified him. And that wasn't uncommon for the Romans to do. There were gods all over the place. In fact, usually Caesar was a god, was divine. And so when they deified this young boy, they printed a coin, some of the currency. Had the boy on it, and around this boy, and they found some of these coins in archaeological digs, around this boy were 7 stars. Now the right hand of God through the Old Testament represented power and authority. So here we have Christ the King of the 7 leaders, the angels or the elders of the 7 churches. So he has authority over the church. No matter how well it's doing, no matter how weak it's behaving or how evil has crept in, John has a revelation of Jesus that he is still in control and working through the church no matter how flawed and imperfect it may be. Do you need to hear that this morning? Oh, it's easy to read the book of Revelation and read ourselves into it and see all the deficiencies and all the flaws and forget that regardless of that, Christ is still King of his church. This is wonderful news. But on top of that, can you imagine living in a country where even the currency that you used was printed with an anti-Christian doctrine? Now in North America, we don't have this experience. We have currency that does not have anti-Christian sentiment on it typically. And so can you imagine if your way of conducting business always when you looked down was to see something that stood absolutely contrary to the message of Jesus Christ? Could it be that Jesus, through John the Revelator, was also acknowledging, hey, you know what? Even those 7 stars, the 7 stars of our culture, no matter where the culture is going, I still have power. I am still sovereign because I say I am. Now, we're living in a day and age where we sometimes forget this. We feel a certain amount of obligation to yell louder, to scream harder, because the church in North America, at least, which is where most of you are watching me from, is used to having a certain amount of privilege and voice. We get certain benefits and benefits of the doubt sometimes, and that's starting to be stripped away. And so we are on the front end, I believe, of what the churches here that were the recipients of these letters knew all too well. How exciting it would be to have a reminder every time you looked at the coin, not of the power of the spirit of the age, but instead that Christ sees the 7 stars that man prints in metal, and he raises us. Not only is he the king of the church, the 7 rulers or the 7 angels or elders of the church, not only is there still the power of God found in the church, no matter how deficient it might be, but likewise, there is still power at work in our communities and in our culture. No matter how evil or apathetic, no matter how cold or distant it might be, there is still the power of God available to you and to me. And that's just in Revelation chapter 1. When we read the other 2 chapters, we read specific letters that were written to specific churches all through what's now modern-day Turkey. And as I already said, there was some pretty dark stuff in there, and it made me wonder about Christ's communication. Christ has already established that he's the king, but what about his communication? What gave him the right or the authority to speak the way that he spoke through John to these churches? Well, Kim Scott recently wrote a book called Radical Candor, and she talks about the culture in which we live, how even though we need people who will challenge us and give us difficult truths about ourselves, we're living in a culture where that's incredibly unpopular. We want people who will simply be yes people, who will look into our lives and tell us all the things we're doing right, how beautiful we are, how wonderful we are, how correct we are, how valid our opinion is, and how nobody should argue with those opinions. And what she calls that is ruinous empathy. We may care for the people that we say that to, but if we never ever challenge, if we never enter into a place where that can be thought about and reasoned and maybe proven to be false, then that actually creates an environment where people are ruined. And Jesus is not guilty of this in these 7 letters to 7 churches, is he? But on the flip side, if all we do is take pot shots at our culture, at our neighbors, at strangers, and this typically happens in social media nowadays, if all we do is criticize and condemn without knowing the people, without engaging and without caring, then we just become obnoxious and destructive. We achieve nothing, we lose the right to be heard, and we just are viewed as cranky Christians. Jesus, in these 7 letters, finds a way to communicate in a way that Jesus always did. Where Proverbs tells us to speak life, to not speak out and to nail our hopes on the negative thoughts, but instead to speak words of life. Jesus is doing just that. He is communicating truths because he has both established his love and his care for the people of God, which he did in his earthly ministry as well. But likewise, he refuses to simply massage and uselessly encourage sin. And this is something Paul did with the New Testament church, with his letters and the epistles. This is something that James, the book of James, is famous for. This is something that throughout Jesus' ministry he is famous for not only affirming folks, but also calling out and telling people to quit sinning. And so these 7 churches receive letters with great joy because A, they are reminded that Christ is still on the throne. Now this is where we get to apply context, and this is where we get to cross the bridge. After we understand what Jesus was saying to the original hearers through John in this image of Christ and the letters that he received in his own tribulation in the cave while he was imprisoned, now is when we get to cross the bridge of application into our own lives. So, for example, with the 7 stars, which is more important for us to be reminded of? Is it more important for us to be reminded that our local church, with all of its flaws and with all of its messiness and imperfection, maybe maybe they're adrift, maybe we're struggling to do all things right during a global pandemic, maybe we're getting tired and weary. Is it important for us to recognize that Christ is still King of his church? Yes. Maybe we're looking at our culture and we're just seeing how drastically things are changing, how quickly we are departing from some of the moral and societal norms that we were brought up with. And maybe we need to see that Christ is still sovereign and king, even over those things, even if we don't understand how or why he's going to make all things right. Is that what we need to hear? Maybe, yes. You know, a professor told me just last week that there was a research study done where a teacher was teaching on the parable of the Prodigal Son. And in the room were 3 distinct societal groups and ethnic groups. And as he asked the question, why was the prodigal son hungry? Each ethnic group had a very distinct yet biblical answer. One group said that the prodigal son was hungry because he had squandered everything that he had. That group is the group that I'm a part of, the North American group. There was another group who said the prodigal son was left hungry because no one shared with him. And there was a third group that equally validly said that the prodigal son was hungry because there was a famine in the land. All 3 of these things were biblical. But all 3 of these things are distinct and they are spoken of in ways that are unique to our culture and how we read Scripture. So I wonder, how will you read the letters to the churches? Will you read the letters and find weapons that you can take pot shots at your own church and say, yeah, that's us. Jesus is mad at us. Or will you read them and say, yeah, that was all them. That was all them. That was all them. There's nothing that we can relate to here. Or will you say, the same Christ who is King of the church and King of our culture also desires to continue to communicate to and through the church today. And now, do you see why it was so important that you read the letters yourself? I hope maybe you're inspired to read them again with new eyes, what it would be like to read in the 1st century, a persecuted church that was in a culture that all roads seemed to lead to heaven, according to the modern day plan. And to get this letter that was written specifically to you from Christ the King. As you may know, I'm a therapist, and there is nothing, it seems, that's more painful than indifference. Our children will sometimes act out just to get our attention because they prefer to have negative attention over no attention at all. There's grown adults who are wounded for their lifetime because there was indifference demonstrated to them as children. There are some who are watching today that were brought up with a version of religion that was guilt-based, that you live with chronic guilt, that if you hear a sermon about the grace of Jesus, then it seems somewhat shallow to you because you're used to feeling guilty when you either come in or leave an engagement with the Christian community. I don't know where you stand, but I know this, that Christ is not going to treat you with apathy He's not going to simply empathize and never challenge you. He cares enough to call you by name. On the flip side, He's not the Christ or the King that all He has to say are challenges, 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 all that you've done wrong. He, throughout Scripture, when He was alive in His earthly ministry, He continued to both support, encourage, and build up those who were wounded, while at the same time calling you and calling me to a higher place. These 7 churches and what Christ teaches through John to the 7 churches will be revisited at the very end of the book. Remember that. In the very last 2 chapters or so, we're going to circle around to these 7 churches. We're going to revisit the 7 churches, and Christ continues to promise that if the church is faithful, there is a destiny. If the church is faithful to Christ, there is paradise that awaits, and that's for another Sunday. So I encourage you, reflect on what you've heard today. Both the 7 stars and the 7 lampstands, the image of Christ found in chapter 1, and then how you would read chapters 2 and 3 if you were in that day and age. And then, and that only then, what does Christ have to teach us today? All my prayer for you as you read the next 2 chapters, chapters 4 and 5, is that you continue to get a glimpse of Jesus Christ the King in His glory, in what we call the throne of heaven, or the throne room of heaven. I hope you enjoy that reading. Remember to keep your notebook close at hand. God bless you, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. We'll see you next time.